Christian Temperance Union. Prohibition is a term we are all familiar with. We have learned about it through our various years in school, but we are all unfamiliar with some of the movement groups that help spread the idea of prohibition. One group in particular is the Women Christian Temperance Union, otherwise known as the WCTU, which helped people jump on the bandwagon for prohibition. We found many similarities among all 4 of the posters we examined. One important similarity was the presence of the WCTU. Our main goal as a group was to set out to see what role the WCTU had on the country and what their main goal was. We will also be determined in finding out if the WCTU was successful in their goal. The Women Christian Temperance Union was first founded in Ohio in 1874. The main goal of the WCTU was to upgrade moral life, which would then include the abstinence from alcohol. Besides abstinence from alcohol, WCTU has also supported research and education concerning tobacco and narcotics. The Women Christian Temperance Union's main goal was to urge society to remain abstinent from alcohol. The way they did this was local sit-ins at the local bars, self-made newspapers, lectures, books, and sewing saloons. These women would also work to train the youth to educate others in abstinence. It is important for there to be representation of this union in every state, city, town, and village. The first poster was very eye-catching because of the rolls of paper walking to the Capitol building. Next to the rolls of paper are little boys playing the trumpet to a song with the lyrics, "John Barleycorn, Goodbye." John Barleycorn was a personification of beer and whiskey, so this is not a real person. It refers to the barley that was used to make many various alcoholic beverages. The reason the people were playing these lyrics out of their trumpets was because the WCTU wanted there to be national prohibition. A national prohibition would mean everyone across the country would say goodbye to John Barleycorn, aka beer and whiskey. This movement led to nationwide funerals of John Barleycorn, which would allow Americans to officially say goodbye to alcohol and begin the Prohibition of 1920. Secondly, on these rolls of paper is text saying Petition for National Constitutional Prohibition. This is a big deal because it meant the WCTU had confidence and sacrality in what they believed this movement held as their end goal. This goal being to change fundamentals of the federal government. This movement proved to be extraordinarily hard to change, especially without precedent. Also, these rolls of paper symbolize how big and powerful the organization both expected and eventually became. When the WCTU became powerful, it meant having to manage to get a large percentage in Congress, going across party lines to form a congressional supermajority. The WCTU would inevitably be successful, with managing to lobby around 70% of Congress behind the matter.
The second poster is called Water Wagon. It brings up 3 main aspects that are relevant. The first being the focus on states banning alcohol, the WCTU's ability to create various symbols for the movement, and their ability to generate appeal to the idea of the sophisticated, sober man. For context, I'll start with their ability to create recognizable symbols for the idea of prohibition, which is shown here through the water wagon the men sit on. The water wagon was a symbol. Well, the water wagon was a symbol to represent somebody acting in a state of sobriety and subsequently living off water. With that, the terms fell off the water wagon, hop on the water wagon, over the water wagon will all mean different things in reference to someone or a state's stance on temperance. This showed the influence the WCTU had even earlier on, managing to grain symbols like this, as we also saw previously, with John Barleycorn, into the consciousness that could allow certain ideas to stay in the head of the American populace despite some abstract concepts. The document also shows a secondary tactic employed by the WCTU, which was to go along with lobbying the federal government, this being the shift in attitude towards state governments. This strategy is interesting as it contradicts the first document, as money spent to win on the state level would seemingly be wasted once the federal government started to implement these policies anyways. But this would be explained by Frances Willard, the head of the WCTU, who wanted to do what she called a do-everything philosophy, where the organizations will keep a mass variety of tactics in order to implement change. This was probably helpful for the organization overall, as it allowed for the organization to have victories and subsequent boosts of morale over time. By boosting people's morale, more individuals would be willing to continue activism and possibly even bring in more teetering women. The last piece of information to be brought from this poster was how it was intended to appeal to voters, as we see that the people on board are all wearing suits and fancy hats. The assumed rationale for this is that it gives a sense of sophistication and wealth, or in this case, to people, or in this case, the states that support the prohibition. They show the other side, interestingly though, not as a drunk person, but as a child or young man trying to get on. This is likely because they aren't necessarily wanting to make non-prohibitionists and people who do use alcohol see evil, but possibly misguided, as they do want to appeal to these people to incentivize them to become pro-temperance in order to gain clout. The third document is called Is It a Square Deal? The first part that I want to emphasize is the document where it has the line, the mischief the saloons work, the farmer of the county foot the heaviest bill, in combination with the image of showing two well-suited aristocratic men, these men as personifications of the city and council, both holding large wads of cash implied to be from licensing being bought to distribute alcohol. The important aspect of this is the interest group that they are trying to appeal to, that being farmers. The appeals were made obvious here, as they treat farmers being the ones to flip the bill, and then specifically for the cities, whom the farmers around the turn of the 20th century had used as rationale and scapegoat for the onslaught debt that they had started to accrue. And then adding on to this is another example for them for a supposed pro-urban biased government. The WCTU managed to get demographics like this in the end was very important, as ideas like the temperance and women's suffrage, which many in the organization had deeply supported, had grown deeply associated with the progressive and socialist movements, these movements which had generally had more appeal with northern city workers, but in order to prove temperance on a national level, especially if they wanted to be constitutional, had to become a bipartisan organization. As we've seen, they started associating themselves with Southern and Democratic-based populist movement, similar to the WCTU. This was also strongly religious and believed in government intervention in the economy. The only thing that exclamates is how this helped the poor and especially rural farmers. Overall, it seems that this performed fairly well, as only having a few vote point difference between Republicans and Democrats in the movement, although they did fail to attract more constitutional-focused members of the Democratic Party like President Woodrow Wilson. Another worthwhile aspect is that this propaganda seems contradictory in strategy to the water wagon, as it seems to villainize the well-suited, sophisticated man as a sort of incarnation of an evil petite bourgeoisie figure. This could be another way of appealing to a southern farmer who is more likely to want to be distant from the more northern-style rich man, seen as a homegrown poor person as a more prestigious and honorable figure. It's important to look at issues in this way, since it gives insight on how the WCTU gained influence. It gives a deeper look into historical cultural groups.
The final document we examined as a group was a document called We'll Make the Map All White. This specific document caught our attention because of the line of men and women that were labeled all differently by their occupations, while holding up paintbrushes to paint a black and white colored map of the United States. The goal of this map was to make all the states white. Discussing this within our group, we all agreed that they were trying to make the United States pure, and so men and women would be treated as equals. This document corresponds with all of the others in the Women's Temperance Union because a map was created of the United States by prohibitionists to represent where alcohol is allowed and where it is not allowed. And since these maps were used for many different representations of how different the states were in many ways, this created a map made to represent the women's suffrage movement across the United States. Maps made for prohibitionists and the women's suffrage movements became so known and beneficial that opponents even started to use them to make cases of their own. The two movements of the prohibitionists and the women's suffrage movement had the same goals and drive for what they both wanted to help each other along the way. Many women in the women's suffrage movement sought for the right to vote so that they could advance prohibition that soon enough landed in their favor. The Women's Christian Temperance Union did many remarkable things throughout our history. The WCTU's goal was to make a constitutional law against alcohol, gain equality and the right to vote, and gained it all by making the map white in their fight together and with other groups that hold the same values. The Women's Christian Temperance Union spread the idea of prohibition and was able to achieve this goal by their many marches as seen in the documents. Today, nothing would have changed in the world if it wasn't for the WCTU fighting for the equality.